So much of the debates we have about history are usually wrong because we begin the process by considering flawed perspectives as primary conditions. It's like taking aim with a sight which is completely skewed, and we refuse to correct it. That is the state of information, leadership, and reporting we have today. Deliberately off kilter, no desire to address reality as it is to be found, rather a need to bend the communications to such an extent as to hope one day the facts match the storyline. Yet that's not a model by which to manage social woes, and there are many of those. In this talk with Esheru, we claw back some of the story's facades and take a look at why they are flawed and how we can prompt change peacefully if we only do so concertedly. Thank you, Esheru, for your time and your insights. This is TwoandaMic. Rise up and be curious.
Dung weche pek kod welo mabiro e TwoandaMic. Dung parodit kod jok mawuoye TwoandaMic. Seche tin sud buta wawinji e TwoandaMic. Ola wachokre wabed piny bi wawinje ero chako momit ndi TwoandaMic podcast makende.
I'm joined once again by my activist friend, Esheru. How are you, man?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you for having me once again. This is becoming a very regular thing.
It's very regular. I mean, this occasion, it always feels like it's been a long time in between when we do the podcast. But having said that, we're always in touch. All sorts is going on around the world. And our topic is going to slightly sort of touch on that, but also make general reference to political situations that we can see in many different parts of the world. What strikes you at the moment, which is of not necessarily particular interest, but what do you think is perhaps where most of your focus is lying as it goes?
I think at the moment is how people are once again being hoodwinked into believing this war in the Middle East. I mean, you really only have to kind of join the dots to work out that it was always going to lead towards attacking Iran, however you cut this thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's also interesting is a lot of people don't know is from the Armenian perspective. People might not know that the Armenians were ethnically cleansed by Azerbaijan with the assistance of Israel, and what role that has to play in this particular war is that Azerbaijan lies to the northeast of Iran, and there are some parts of Iran where there are historically ethnic Azeris. Even though a country never existed before the 1920s called Azerbaijan, but ethnically the population did exist because they are connected in many ways with the Turks. So they speak a form of Turkish, a dialect of Turkish and so on. And recently, because of Israel's growing relationship with Azerbaijan and the fact that they have sent so many, 60% of Azerbaijan's weapons come from Israel, for example, with which they use to bombard and blockade the Armenian population, which completely is now gone from its ancestral lands. But they are using Azerbaijan as a staging point also for some of their work or some of their missions, as it were, their military missions. And Azerbaijan apparently have told Israel not to hit those parts of Iran where there are ethnic Azeri communities. So it would seem to me that whatever plans that they had, this or surrounding Iran, this has been going on for years, absolute years. So as you say, this is nothing new. This was always the plan.
And let's also remember with Azerbaijan, it strikes me as no surprise that Israel is there as a growing ally. Azerbaijan is United States friendly. I believe that the United States have been there for some time. And it has a lot to do with the fact that it has a lot of natural gas. So they support the Azerbaijani, would we say regime or would we say government?
Definitely regime. I mean, we're talking about a petro dictatorship hardcore over here.
There we go. So
forget civil rights and human rights there.
you can always guarantee if Israel are in there, the United States are there too. If the United States are there, so are Israel, and to a lesser extent, Great Britain. I'll never leave them off the map when I discuss the US, because one spawned the other, and when one jumps, the other one says how high. Just how it is.
Indeed, and also kind of like to put a bit more meat onto that. Apparently, the largest foreign investor as a company into Azerbaijan is BP. So
there you go.
Yeah,
always on the same page. Yep.
Yeah. So I think you're right. I think people need to wake up to the fact that this wasn't simply because everybody's saying, okay, how come that 2 days before Trump was supposed to have this deal with Iran, that suddenly Israel attacked? It's not a coincidence.
Yeah, but no, it's not a coincidence, and that's something that many people actually missed. The day before Israel attacked Iran, I believe President Trump was heading somewhere. I don't know if he's going on a flight. And a reporter asked him, why have the US decided to call home non-military personnel from, I think it was 2 Gulf states. I can't remember which ones they were. And he says, oh, you'll have to wait and see, were his words. And this was 2 days before Israel decided to strike Iran. And I knew at that point something was going to happen. And the British, today I've learned, and the Americans, also yesterday, have been calling home non-military personnel from various countries across the Middle East.
So definitely things are in motion. And I mean, what I see happening publicly as well, people can see Israel is bombing civilian infrastructure. Iran is also bombing civilian and well, I don't know about necessarily communications, but from what I've seen, civilian infrastructure as well. And I mean, I've always been against war in all of its guises. I don't think that any kind of military exercise should be targeting civilian infrastructure.
No, but what's fascinating, I agree, I'm with you, critical infrastructure should always remain in place. What's fascinating is how I believe Danny Danon, who used to be Israeli UN spokesperson, he now works in another capacity for the Israelis. He put out a tweet talking about how shameful it was that Iran is targeting hospitals. And I quote tweeted him back, is this satire? I mean, it seems as though they've now identified hospitals that are off limits for bombing, after destroying the hospital in Gaza.
Exactly. Is there a single hospital left in Gaza?
All critical infrastructure in Gaza is being destroyed. And this is the very thing. When people sit and they almost sit in, aghast at what's happened. Or should I say the media? That's the right way to put it. I'm listening to the media talk about Gaza as if it's something that's just kind of happened in isolation over the last few weeks. And I don't know much about war, but I do know if you start targeting key and critical infrastructure in any country, schools, hospitals, ambulance service, educational institutions, etc., if you start targeting key infrastructure within any country, it means that you want the people gone from that country.
Yeah,
that's it. And once Israel started getting rid of key infrastructure, instead of calling it out that they're trying to get rid of the people, the media was then playing around. Did they really mean it? Or we don't know if this is true. Is it the IDF? Is it how? They've aided and abetted them throughout the entire way. Held their hand through the process, if you will.
It's also what we saw that they did with Libya, and look what happened in Libya, unfortunately, with the destruction of all of their civilian infrastructure.
Failed state.
So, I mean, the reason why, one of the reasons why we're talking about this at the moment, I came across this post on Twitter, and recently you mentioned media as well, and I've been speaking with lots of people, and I don't trust BBC, I don't trust any of these other state news services because of the levels of propaganda that they essentially put out there. And there was recently some analysis of the BBC, and apparently it was 33 times more likely to publish a pro-Israel news piece than pro-Palestinian. And in the interests of impartiality, that doesn't work. So when people then ask me, okay, so where do you go? And I've kind of followed what you've done, Esheru, because you've always looked at independent organizations, and independent local groups which are not influenced by external either funding. These are people who want subscriptions from people who support their individual channels.
Yeah.
And I try to find these, and I come across also students in these areas. And I believe there's a woman here from Lebanon, and she wrote this amazing little thread, which I'll post in the notes as well. And she says, and here's the problem that Western audiences do not understand, because had they understood, they'd have moved a long time ago. When institutions of thought and leadership are crushed or even weakened, and she's referring here to the plan to kill Khamenei, the outcome isn't peace, but unmanaged anger. Resistance doesn't disappear. And it's these three words which really struck me. Resistance doesn't disappear. And this is something that you and I know from our own cultural heritage.
Correct. Absolutely correct. It doesn't. And I think people who are marginalized are constantly fighting struggle. They're constantly pushing for change. Sometimes the fights that we are fighting gets a bit of airtime. People join us in the fight, but it's always temporary. And then once the excitement or the buzz around that dies down, people move on, but we continue fighting. We just continue fighting. So the struggle never stops. It's a constant thing. It's constant, it's perpetual.
Two examples which spring to mind, one of them from the Armenian history, one of them also from a lot of the things that I've learned from reading up about the slave trade. People always say, okay, but why didn't they fight back? Why is it that the West had to liberate the African nations and African peoples and stop the slave trade? Whereas we know that that's not the case. And we also know that even until today, I think we had a talk about it the other day on the telephone, even until today, Haiti is being punished for the role it played in ending the slave trade.
Let's remember one thing, and this is a key point for the listeners out there. One thing the capitalists and the people that run our world do not like is the disruption of their money supply. If you ever want change in any society, stop spending your money, withhold your labor, and you can crash an economy and get them listening to exactly what you want, because they don't like a disruption in the money supply. Haiti was punished for that particular reason by the French, and of course the Americans prevent them from developing. And it has always been this way. Malcolm X, Martin Luther King rather, when they became a threat, it wasn't because they were talking about improving civil rights for Black people in the United States of America. It was because they then started talking about improving civil rights for everybody. And that's when they became a threat, because the establishment knew that they can handle a few million Black people. When you're talking the bulk of the country and it's going to disrupt their money supply, they couldn't have that. So rather than getting people realizing, hold on, we should all be working together to solve this issue, they got rid of the people who may have caused that problem in the beginning. And they did exactly the same with Fred Hampton.
And still, another thing which brings those three words back to us, resistance doesn't disappear. As much as the heads of certain organizations, certain movements were taken out, the people were still there. The resistance was still fighting. People were still doing what they had to do, but perhaps the path that they took was a bit different. And that's what sometimes is not recognized. Absolutely.
And just going back to slavery, very, very briefly, there was a lot of slave revolts across the Caribbean. Sharpeville Massacre, Taki's Revenge. You had Nani and Cudjoe, who led the Maroons in Jamaica. You had Toussaint Louverture in Haiti. These are just the ones that we know, that are spoken about, most of all. But there was literally hundreds. And when people talk about the ending of slavery, there were many factors, but two of the main factors as to why slavery ended. First of all, mechanization. It no longer became tenable because it just wasn't profitable after a while. But also, they couldn't manage the slave revolts across the Caribbean. But let's remember, the British will never talk about the losses that they incurred. They'll never talk about the fights that they never won. They'll always talk about all the good things that they've done and the fights that they win.
And the reality with regards to the Armenian cultural history that I was referring to, resistance doesn't disappear, is that over the hundreds of years that the Ottomans at first occupied and then conquered Armenian lands, so what is now Eastern Turkey was a part of Greater Armenia. The people over those centuries, as much as they were punished and beaten down, they still managed to survive. And instead, when the leaders were killed, as they were, or when they were in some way usurped into following the Ottoman government's wishes, the resistance went underground. The resistance went low-key. Resistance went local. And so people did what they had to do to survive until at some point it became so bad that they simply had to then spark up this rebellion, which began in the 1900s and eventually led in 1918 to the independence of Armenia, having gone through various stages of genocide from the 1890s until 1915, unfortunately. So as much as there were operations to kill and destroy the entire population, somehow they found a way to rise up and be not necessarily victorious, because when you've lost so many people, you cannot consider that a victory.
No.
And so when we think about what has happened in Palestine and Gaza, when we think about what's going to happen in Iran, perhaps, and also other areas, as much as they have endured, they will still never consider any kind of liberation a victory. They will simply call it justice.
Absolutely. I need to make a correction. I said Sharpeville Massacre. It wasn't the Sharpeville Massacre. It was a Christmas rebellion. It was led by Samuel Sharp. Just got to correct myself there for listeners' benefit.
Cool. Thank you for that. But there are lessons here. And unfortunately, these lessons are not being learnt. When we talk about the destruction that followed, for example, in Iraq, one of the reasons why they didn't care about the destruction to civilian infrastructure or the entire country is because they knew that after the war, they would be awarded construction contracts.
This is what it comes down to, right? The reason why Afghanistan happened and we went into Iraq, and the reason why Iraq happened is because nobody was held accountable for Afghanistan. Then Libya happened, and the reason why that happened is because nobody was ever held accountable for Iraq and Afghanistan. And fast forward to this point, the reason why these things are allowed to continue is because no one is ever held accountable. In fact, people are rewarded. George Bush, Tony Blair, David Cameron, Sarkozy, Obama, they're all being rewarded for their actions. We just have to look at the last 20 years. So I always say that it isn't leaders that decide that go to war. I believe that the big organizations who donate to presidential campaigns and prime ministerial campaigns, I believe that they're the movers and the shakers. They're the ones that encourage war in certain regions, especially if you have an organization, let's say you're a large soft drinks company. I don't want to name anything for the fear of being for libeling anyone. But let's just say you're a very large soft drinks company and you're doing X amount of billing over this part of the world, but there's a whole region over here that you can get into. But because of the leadership of that region, you can't get your soft drinks into that market. You're going to donate to somebody that you can encourage to maybe start a war to topple that leader over that side. You understand me? And of course, as you say, the contracts to rebuild the country once everything's fallen to pieces. And again, that money just goes back from the people of one country back into the hands of the very wealthy people that own the companies to rebuild. But often the rebuilds never work. Look at Libya. I'm not even sure if they've even attempted Libya, but certainly Iraq. Iraq hasn't rebounded since Saddam Hussein has been toppled.
And what's also interesting is, okay, who gets to pay for a country's rebuild? Obviously, those resources are stolen from the country. The oil is stolen from the country, and the oil that is made from that theft essentially pays for the reconstruction. So basically, companies or groups of companies get their work paid for, and they don't have to do anything for it. The money's just there.
Absolutely. I remember watching a documentary about the Iraq War, and there was a soldier or a serving officer talking about the time where he had to guard. They were flying literally pallets of dollar bills into the country. So they flew all this money into the country, and they handed out all the money to various people who said there were security teams, until the money disappeared. And let's remember, they also emptied the banks in Iraq, so there was no money there. Looted all the gold. There was absolutely nothing left in the country for there was actually no money left. Yeah. They then turned to the acting government and said, "Well, nationalize your oil now, or privatize your oil rather." Yeah. So the goal was to break the country so they could get control of the oil. And it's a very similar thing in Libya. Libya was sitting on I don't know how many tons of gold they were sat upon. They had a lot of gold. All that gold has disappeared, and the oil has been siphoned off by the West.
Indeed. And obviously, it's something which will remain a secret, because then otherwise you put all of that gold onto the market, and that kind of reduces the price of gold, and nobody wants that to happen either. So
absolutely. And you know, I do believe that we are going to see a shift very soon, because this level of evil depravity can't continue. At some point, it has to. You know, the law of averages and the energy that you give out, it does come back to you, and I do believe that, you know, it will come back.
Yeah, and that's actually a point which a kind of final point which I wanted to ask you about. So obviously there are lots and lots of people who are sitting there frustrated at home from all sides of the arguments. Some people who are also pro-colonialism, some people who are very much against colonialism, and they're all sitting at home and they're all angry and they're all doing what they do, and they see these protests, even though they're peaceful protests, but they still don't like them, or they see whatever's happening in a certain country and they don't like that. So where do they release their frustration? I agree with you. I think the fabric of society, even in Western nations, is going to, at some point, fall apart. We are going to see the dismantling of our society. And this isn't me being like, I'm not fear-mongering here. You can see it. There were 2,000 protests in the USA on one day against the president. And we can see, if you on social media, so many people are just completely dissatisfied with their leaders. This is going to come to a head at some point, isn't it?
I definitely believe that. Now, it is my hope that we'll have some kind of civil unrest in the country where people come together and try to push for change. But I'm a strong advocate for no violence. I'm a strong advocate for not moving around. And as I said at the top of the show, withhold your labor and don't spend your money for a week, and you'll have your government exactly where you want them. That's what people need to do. They don't even need to leave their apartments. Yes, take the dogs for a walk, take the children out to play, but stay at home. This is the best form of protest that we can give right now. And I believe it's what people need to do to force through change, because a lot of people are very unhappy. If you look at what's happening in Northern Ireland, if you look at here in Britain, where we had a summer of unrest last year, if you look at the US, in literally all parts of Europe and then various parts of the world, it's because people are feeling the pinch. People are tired. They're hungry. Cost of living crisis, eating into the little money they have. They can't afford to take as many holidays, if at all. You know, people used to enjoy going out for a drink a couple of times a month to eat. They can no longer do these things, but the money can always be found to maim and kill people in the country, under the guise of protecting our freedoms, ensuring that we have even more refugees that our leaders don't want to take care of. I mean, you know, at some point it has to end.
Yeah, of course. And also the propaganda just simply has reached a stage where it's so rubbish, it's so pathetic, it's so obvious, and it's so transparent that nobody's believing it anymore.
People have lost. People are like, you know what, forget this, I'm not interested. You know, they know the game is up.
Yeah, definitely, man. It's always great speaking with you, Esheru. It's always great hearing your insights. Peaceful resistance is the way forward. I really hope to see some positive change as well in society. Let's see it happen.
And yes, indeed. Thank you very much.
And mic.